Hello, my name is Dr. Alex Albans. I'm a research fellow at Birmingham City University's West Midlands National Park Lab. I'll be presenting this paper, but it's also been written with Catherine Moore, who's past president of the International Federation of Landscape Architects and Professor of Landscape Architecture at Birmingham City University. The title of this paper is Site as a Mediated Landscape Interpretation. It's about how we as landscape architects get to know a site, how we work with them, how we look at them, how we understand them, and the part we play in determining what will happen with them in the future. First, we'll spend a little time exploring what I mean when I talk about site in the context of landscape architecture, specifically how the terms site and landscape are related. Next, we'll examine two traditional approaches to getting to know sites, and then explore an alternative approach illustrated with work from BCU's postgrad landscape architecture course. Finally, I'll conclude by proposing that the process of getting to know a site is best understood as a mediated landscape interpretation, and what I mean by that. We're situating this paper within a discourse which combines new ideas about landscape, the teaching of design, and how the two intersect in the practice of landscape architecture and urban design on tangible, everyday sites, the places where we all live and work. Before looking at what I mean by the term site, I want to spend a few moments outlining how I understand landscape so that I can make an important link between the two. There's a great deal of scholarship on the subject of landscape, and I've based this work on three specific understandings of landscape. First, a summary of the European Landscape Convention, where landscape's understood to be an area perceived by humans which is the result of the interaction between humans and nature. The second definition I'm working with is from my co-author Catherine Moore, who describes landscape as the relationship we have with the land in response to its materiality, going on to say that we're part of the landscape, not passive observers. And finally, information from my PhD, making the distinction between land and landscape. Land is what we stand on. Landscape is our ideas about the land. Our ideas about the land affect how we treat the land and what we do with it. The landscape around us is the physical outworking of our ideas about the land. Now, humans have always interacted with the world around us. We've altered landform and ecologies for agriculture, habitation, infrastructure, and as symbols of religion, power, and wealth. So for the purposes of this paper and in the context of landscape architecture, I understand landscape to be the relationship we have with the land. That means it's our ideas about the land, or it's the values we project onto the land. Furthermore, the materiality of the landscape is the manifestation of our relationship with the land. Landscape is a mirror of our values. Landscape is simultaneously an idea and the manifestation of that idea. The two are inseparable. What we do with the land around us differs between cultures and civilizations, but our actions are always a result of the values, priorities, technology, and culture of a particular time and location. The term landscape also speaks of an expansive scale, a richness of history, and a profound relationship between human beings, the land, and its ecosystems. In contrast, site is most often defined as a piece of land, a red line on a plan. While that's fine for identification purposes, it is a reductive representation which separates a site from the wider landscape. Defining a site as just a piece of land is in itself a cultural interpretation of the land. It's one way of describing the relationship we have with the land, albeit a pretty basic and unhelpful description. So we end up with landscape being the rich, nuanced term, and site the simplified, technical term. So we might ask ourselves, if an expansive term such as landscape exists, why can't site remain just the physical location within which landscape architects practice, and allow landscape to carry the torch for the inspiration and creativity of landscape architecture? The key to this lies with the practice of the discipline. Although the profession is called landscape architecture, and at its best practitioners do engage with the landscape in its fullest meaning, there's a sense in which the landscape needs to be captured and brought onto the computer screen or drawing board. And it's at this point that landscape becomes site, so that the work of a landscape architect can be related to a specific area and a specific brief. In a sense, landscape architecture becomes site architecture, and it's here, in the process of distinguishing a site from the landscape, that the first of two issues becomes apparent when teaching landscape architecture students. The two issues are, firstly, the techno-scientific analysis of a site, which is associated with rationality and intelligence most often, and secondly, the way of assessing a site known as communing with the genius loci, or sensing the spirit of the place, that sort of thing, and that's associated with sensory modes of thinking. And these two issues both stem from the idea that in landscape architecture, design inspiration should come from the site. And it follows that the process of getting to know a site survey for example, is undertaken before we begin to make design decisions and creative interpretations. This way of thinking assumes we can and must obtain some form of objective knowledge about the site before we begin designing. And we see this idea manifest time and time again in diagrams of the design process. For example, survey, analysis, design, probably the most famous, but something else like prepare, then design and refine, for example. Site survey and analysis always come before design, before creativity. They contain the idea that we don't start thinking creatively until we understand the site we're working with. Let's examine them in a bit more detail then, beginning with a techno-scientific analysis of the site. In essence, this is the attempt to measure everything we find in a site, and that if we collect enough of the right data, a design solution will be obvious. The data collected as part of these surveys is also seen as neutral, free from value judgment or cultural interpretation. You can't argue with contours, rainfall patterns or population density. They're all facts after all. Compounding this method of getting to know a site is the way that sites are graphically portrayed. When we're given a site to survey, it likely comes to us in the form of a plan describing the extent and limits of our professional involvement. This form of black and white drawing risks separating and emptying the site when it's transposed from physical and cultural reality onto a sheet of paper or a computer screen. If we're not careful, the plan becomes the site. Furthermore, maps themselves are viewed as scientific data, an accurate and objective reflection of the site, instead of the selective and partial representation that they really are. As a scientific process, this way of getting to know a site requires us to leave our ideas, assumptions and prejudices at the site boundary and focus on what we can observe. It says that design will come later, after we've analysed our findings. Now, I want to make it clear that we're not saying that the information collected in this type of site survey isn't important. Of course not. It's absolutely vital. But what I am saying is that it's just that. It's information. It's one perspective on the site. It's one way of examining the relationships humans have with the land. It's one interpretation of the world around us. Okay, so the second of the two approaches I want to address is what I'm calling communing with the genius loci. This is the idea that as designers we should have an innate ability to sense, intuit, feel or pick up on the vibes of a site, and that through this sensitivity the site will tell us what it is and what it wants to be. The term genius loci, which is Latin for spirit of place, has two distinct uses in landscape architecture. First, as a synonym for the character of a place, and second, as a process of getting to know a site. The first definition, as a way of combating placelessness, focuses on the character and distinctiveness of a site, and that has much to recommend it in our homogenized world. The second idea is the one which is problematic in design pedagogy, because, as Catherine Moore argues, it requires us to, quote, empty our minds of contaminating knowledge and forget everything we know, end quote. In contrast to the techno-scientific approach, which could be taught as a systematic process to produce usable data, the so-called sensory approach relies on an apparently innate skill to feel the essence of a place, to sense what it has to say, which is almost impossible to teach. You either have it or you don't, apparently. In both cases, albeit in different ways, students are taught that the site survey is a separate and distinct stage that must come before any creativity or design skill is employed. And both are seeking to find the true essence of the site so that we can derive design inspiration from what we find. The first encourages the notion that site is a separate entity from the landscape that can be boiled down to a set of measurements and diagrams on a page or a screen that are extracted from the landscape, and the latter a mysterious way of communing with the truth of the site that you're either sensitive to or not. Okay, returning to the link between landscape and site. When we understand site in the same way that we understand landscape, as a culturally specific relationship to land and the physical result of that relationship, we realise that it's impossible to encounter a site free from our knowledge, experience, worldview or culture. There is no framework to survey or get to know a site that can produce a neutrally objective truth about the site, because, as Carol Burns argued, quote, you cannot divorce site from the way it is known, end quote. The skill is knowing how to look at a site in a way that generates ideas suitable for our discipline and appropriate for the context. So, with this in mind, how do we teach landscape architect students to look at, investigate and interpret sites? And how does this shape their ability to make design decisions? At BCU, Catherine Moore pioneered an approach to teaching which seeks to equip students with the skills to critically engage with visual, spatial, conceptual and technical elements of the discipline. She describes her approach like this, quote, however we encounter the site, there are a number of ways to describe it, and these are always open to question and subject to change. When we make judgments, crystallise our ideas and make sense of what we feel about the site, it's always based on our experience and expertise. More often than not, we gravitate towards familiar ideas because these all have a reassuring ring of authenticity and credibility about them. The problem and focus of much design education is to ensure, therefore, that we become aware of these easy assumptions, end quote. Disrupting this frame of reference can help students learn to make critical and informed design decisions. And the way to do this, Catherine argues, is, quote, by introducing a new frame of reference to view common problems. And since there is no way of approaching any of the so-called objective parts of design that cannot be put in a wider cultural context, any number of theoretical points of view can quite legitimately be used to investigate the questions raised in response to a brief, end quote. The following project is by Chantel, a student from BCU who graduated a few years ago. Chantel decided to build a frame of reference which combined visual cues from the Surrealist movement, the technology of phytoremediation, and the notion of viewing the landscape through the eyes of her children. She produced a series of investigative models, reflective diary entries, sketches and diagrams, all of which helped her develop a visual, spatial and cultural framework. Over successive iterations and refinements, this became a tool with which she investigated and responded to the site. She interpreted what she found out about the site through the frame of reference she had developed. Chantal could, for example, ask, "What do these sketches tell me about the site?" Or, "What did my visit to the site tell me about these diagrams that I've produced?" At every stage of the process, and after every sketch or diagram, students are encouraged to critically examine their work, asking themselves what they now know as a result of the drawing, the diagram, for example. Has it helped them understand the brief better? Has it enabled them to understand the site in a different way? Has it sparked an idea about what plants to use in their design, for example? Using a unique frame of reference as a tool is a way of developing ideas, becoming familiar with the subject, and interpreting between thoughts, feelings, observations, and knowledge. Words are associated with images, and images are associated with words. And over the course of the project, Chantal's observations were worked into all the other contextual information that she gathered. With guidance, her ideas emerged and a creative, intriguing and contextually appropriate response was developed through successive iterations. This way of working ensures that sites are understood as requiring interpretation. They are not neutral entities. This way of working also introduces multiple perspectives, because in practice we never have the luxury of a single overarching perspective. There are multiple stakeholders: clients, landowners, legislative bodies, consultants, planners, engineers, architects, financiers, and those who use or inhabit the site before and after development. Each of those will see the site differently. Each will have a different relationship with the land. I think that the best way to understand a site is to maintain exactly the same definition of landscape as I've said before, as an idea about the land and the manifestation of that idea. The only difference is that a site is a definable and specific part of that larger whole. And I think the best way to look at or get to know a site is to recognise that the only way to do so is from our own frame of knowledge. There are as many frames of knowledge as there are individuals, and that will shift and change according to profession, education, culture, and so forth. If landscape is the material expression of our ideas about the land, and we as landscape architects have a role in shaping that material expression, we therefore need to think really carefully about which ideas we choose to represent with that material expression. To conclude then, I want to propose that the site survey, which is a process of getting to know a site, essentially, is best understood as a mediated landscape interpretation. Mediated because landscape architects are one of the actors seeking to shape the future of a site. We have to bring together the viewpoints, values and perspectives from all stakeholders and find a solution that works best for them and for the landscape context within which we're working. Landscape because we recognise that humanity has a relationship with the land, sometimes creative, sometimes destructive. Our actions, what we do with the land, reflect the health or otherwise of that relationship. And interpretation because every stage of a project, from survey to final build, requires us to interpret what we find according to our frame of knowledge. And just to end with that quote from Carol Burns again, one cannot divorce sight from the way it is known. Thanks very much for listening. Goodbye.